are in Daniel chapter 5, and I feel like I say this every week in the book of Daniel, but we've got an exciting chapter ahead of us. And Rocky's over here, and he's like, I think you said that every chapter in the last book we went through too. And I'd say, yeah, I did. Here's a quick outline of the book of Daniel.
Now my question is this the one where they get thrown in the pit or not?
No, the lion's den is next week, and the fiery furnace was a few weeks ago. But this one is a pretty famous chapter, and I was telling Nick earlier that it is probably the punniest chapter in the whole Bible because of one particular thing at the very end. And so we're going to talk about it. It's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. Here's an outline of the book. There are 12 chapters in Daniel. It splits directly in half. The first 6 chapters are stories. The back 6 chapters are prophecies and visions that Daniel has. And so it almost feels like 2 different books because the final 6 chapters do not feel at all like the first 6. The first 6 are some of the most famous stories in the entire Bible. The back 6 are some of the most straightforward but also confusing prophecies in the entire Bible. And then there's all this other complicated stuff here because the Old Testament is generally written in what language? Hebrew, right? But there are 2 books of the Bible which have a little bit of Aramaic thrown in there. One of them is Ezra, and then one of them is the book of Daniel. And chapters 2 through 7 of the book of Daniel are written in Aramaic, which is the language of the Babylonian people. Which makes sense because Daniel is living in Babylon, right? This is during this is shortly before the exile, right? Some of the people have already been exiled. Daniel and his friends are amongst that group. And then while Daniel is over there, Jerusalem falls. The rest of the people come over as well. And so this is during the time period of the Babylonian exile, so it makes sense that they start kind of speaking that language. But it is interesting that chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic. You would kind of wish that the different language directly corresponded with the different sections, right? If chapters 1 through 6 were one language and chapters 7 through 12 were another. That's not how it works. Instead, the first chapter of story is in Hebrew, and then the next 5 chapters of story are in Aramaic, and then the first chapter of prophecy is in Aramaic, and the subsequent 5 chapters of prophecy are in Hebrew again, which is kind of weird. And so you actually have it bookended to where the first chapter of each new section is in one language, and the subsequent 5 chapters are in another one. And then to make things even more complicated, the first half of the book is in third person, and then the second half of the book is in first person. And so whenever you look at all of that, the outlying chapter that's really weird there is chapter 7. There's something going on there where it's the prophecy section, but it's still in Aramaic, and it's in first person. And so something's going on there, and for that reason I've got it circled, because whenever we get there, we need to really focus in. Because it seems like something special is going on there, and that would suggest to us that maybe that's like the central focus of the whole book. And I think whenever we get there, we will see that that is kind of confirmed. Anyways, we're in the Aramaic section right now. We talked about how the Aramaic section kind of follows this nice little chiastic structure. Chapter 2 and chapter 7, they both detail these dreams that revolve around 4 kingdoms. And the 4 kingdoms are ultimately displaced by this final kingdom of God, right? And then chapter 3 and chapter 6 both deal with some sort of miraculous deliverance, right? So chapter 3 was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Chapter 6 is Daniel in the lion's den, right? 2 of the most famous stories in the Bible. And then you have chapters 4 and chapter 5. We covered chapter 4 last week. We're going into chapter 5 this week. And those both deal with a proud king being humbled. And so, in particular, can I get somebody to recap what happened in last week's chapter, dealing with Nebuchadnezzar? Nebuchadnezzar has kind of been the focus of these the last 3 chapters. But what went down?
So last week, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, right? It's a different dream from the first one he had of the golden statue with the head with the head being cut off and everything, right? Mm-hmm. He has this dream, and it's of a tree, right? Which at first we assume that is Babylon, right? It's vast, it's big, it provides fruit and shade and food to the beasts and the birds and so on and so forth. And then we see what Nebuchadnezzar calls a seer, what we would call an angel, right? Mm-hmm. And That tree is then cut down and the shackles put around the trunk of the tree, but it is not uprooted. And then, so Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. He already has a pretty good idea what it means, and he realizes it's talking about his kingdom, and then when it talks about the stump and the shackle and all that, it's directly referring to him.
Mm-hmm.
And he asks his magicians, his council, he's like, what do you guys think? Can you, A, tell me the dream, and B, actually, he tells them the dream, and he's like, can you tell me what this means? And they're like, no. Because last time, he said, last time, when he had the dream with the golden head, right, he asked, okay, can you, A, tell me the dream without me telling you the dream, and B, what the dream means? And some of his magicians came forward and tried to lie to him, and he killed him. So you're like, we don't want to mess with this dude. Daniel comes forward, interprets the dream perfectly, and what essentially Daniel gives Nebuchadnezzar advice. He's like, hey, this is going to happen anyway. The best you can do is prolong it, or, push your punishment back a little farther. And eventually does good for about a year, and then he goes up on his rooftop. We compared him to David a little bit with the Bathsheba story. Gets up on the roof, boasts, and then God sends him off to eat grass and be like a beast. And then he'll eventually come back, but what was it, 7 years, right?
7 periods of time.
Okay.
Which we would assume to be years, but it doesn't tell us.
So probably 7 years he's out there with the beasts and all his nobles, and everybody's like, what are you doing? Come back. And eventually God opens his mind again and he comes back. And
yeah, so long story short, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. He wants people to interpret it. Daniel shows up, he interprets it. He says that the tree represents you. God's going to cut you down. He's going to humble you. He's not going to destroy you. He's not going to get rid of your kingdom. But he's going to put you in a place where you are going to basically be like a beast for 7 periods of time. Basically he just says, I wish that this were about your enemy, but unfortunately it's about you. Humble yourself, and maybe you will avoid this. And like you pointed out, Nebuchadnezzar avoids it for about a year. But then he's walking on his palace. He says, wow, look at this amazing kingdom that I built for myself. And God says, you did what? And then, so for 7 periods of time, Nebuchadnezzar is just a wild beast. But then the chapter culminates, and we talked about this is the center of the chiasm right here. It actually culminates with Nebuchadnezzar humbling himself and praising the God of heaven. To where when you actually get to the final verse of chapter 4, it says, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are true and his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. So by the end of the story, Nebuchadnezzar actually learns his lesson. And you've got this pagan king who, keep in mind, is responsible for destroying Jerusalem. Yet he comes to worship the God of Israel. And we actually get to see how God is using the exile to bring Gentiles to himself. And this in many ways kind of foreshadows what we're going to see with the gospel, right? The Jewish people reject God, and as a result, Deuteronomy 32, right? God rejects them, and he takes himself to the Gentiles. And so fast forward to Jesus, the Jewish people are going to reject Jesus, and as a result, where does he go? To the nations, right? He says, go and make disciples of the nations. And that's why we're here, right? And so Daniel kind of foreshadows where that story's heading. But now we're going to work our way back out of the chiasm, starting with today, and we're going to come face to face with another proud king. And this one, unfortunately, is not going to learn the lesson. And so what do you think is going to happen to him by the end of the story?
he's going to die.
I'm guessing he's going to get destroyed.
Yeah, he's going to be destroyed. If you go back to the first dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, remember it was about a statue made of like all these different metals. And the top, what was the head of the statue?
Gold.
It was gold. And what did it represent?
Babylon, but more specifically Nebuchadnezzar himself.
Yeah, so it represented both Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, his final chapter was last week, and today is going to be Babylon's final chapter. Because by the end of today's chapter, Babylon will be destroyed. Hold up. I don't see anybody there. Alright. Anyways, one final thing I want to do before we hop into the chapter. Here's a little timeline. I had something very similar up here back when we first started the book. This timeline kind of just shows you where Daniel fits alongside books like Jeremiah and Ezekiel. We went through Jeremiah before we went through Daniel. We're going to go through Ezekiel after we go through Daniel. Sean led us through Jeremiah. He's going to lead us through Ezekiel. He's not here today because he's at work. But if you look at the timeline, you'll see that the 3 deportations happened between like 605 to 586 BC. And then the returns from from exile are going to start happening around 539 BC, right? Daniel is going to be ministering that entire time. But if you look up at the very top, you will see that Nebuchadnezzar reigned from 605 to 562 BC. Where we left off with Daniel back in chapter 4, we don't know exactly what year that was, but we know it was still during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Whereas now, whenever we pick up, we are actually fast forwarding to the very end of that last ruler right there. His name is Nabonidus. We're not going to see Nabonidus show up in the chapter itself. Instead, we're going to be reading about a king named Belshezzar, who was actually Nabonidus' son. And if you hang around till the very end, I've got some really cool archaeological stuff that will actually explain why Belshazzar's name does not show up on the timeline right here.
Okay, and
Yes.
just had a quick, maybe a little off topic, but do you know the exact year Persia came through and took out the Babylonians?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Babylon fell in October of 539 BC.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that's why it abruptly ends right there. And you'll notice that the very year that Babylon falls directly lines up with the year that the Jews were allowed to return from exile. And that's because the Bible tells us that in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, he issued a decree that they could return back home. And so that's when all that's going to go down. And so like I said, at the very end of today, I'm actually going to pull out some archaeological stuff that will actually explain some things that are really cool from a biblical perspective. Because for decades, if not centuries, there were some scholars who tried to argue that the events that go down in this chapter could not have happened because Daniel just absolutely flubs Babylonian history. But as a result of recent developments in archaeology, we actually see that what the Bible says is actually an accurate portrait of what went down. It's going to be really cool. It's actually one of those really neat things to talk about. So,
And then, and again, we can discuss it later, but this comes to the thing where it's like nations will often try to rewrite their history better than what it actually, or try to portray themselves as a better nation. Or
yeah.
give themselves a
Well,
better
the main
life.
issue with this is that we don't really have. Well, I mean, we'll get there when we get to it. But
Okay.
yeah. So the reason why people get it wrong isn't actually because of Babylonian records. It's because of other records that just didn't go as detailed. Whereas what Daniel writes here actually reflects a more accurate understanding of what was legitimately happening in Babylonian politics at this time. To where it took archaeological records, like discoveries, to actually uncover that. Which, we'll talk about that at the very end. Anyways, that all being said, I mainly showed you the timeline just to show you that we have jumped forward decades. Right? Back in Daniel chapter 4, Daniel was probably still a pretty young guy. We don't know how much time had passed, right? We don't know what year. I don't think it said what year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign was going on. But at this time, he's an old man. Right, he has been in Babylon for like 60 or 70 years. Right, so he is now much older. And then whenever we keep going into the story, it's going to kind of jump around in timeline. That being said, shall we go into it? All right. Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he said to bring the gold and silver vessels, which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly the fingers of a man's hand came out and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the splendor of the king's face changed, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack. and his knees were knocking against each other. The king called out loudly to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king answered and said to the wise men of Babylon, "Any man who can read this writing and declare its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and rule with power as third ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshezzar was greatly alarmed, and the splendor of his face changed further, and its nobles were perplexed.
Okay.
I was telling Nick earlier, to me this feels like a whodunit story, and I love it. What were you going to say, Joseph?
I was going to say that the first thing I kind of noticed is Belshazzar obviously is full of pride. He's hosting this great feast. He's bringing the vessels that were from Israel out, so his concubines, his nobles, wives, everybody can drink from them. He's having this great big celebration, and then it seems like God's finally had enough. He writes something on the wall, which from what I understand is pronouncing the end of Babylon. And then all of a sudden he is shocked, and then he calls for the magicians, and nobody can interpret it.
Yeah.
And he has such a cartoonish reaction to the writing.
Yeah.
Like, it literally describes like a cartoon scene that you like.
Well, yeah, it feels like something that you'd see in like Looney Tunes or just like on Cartoon Network, or like how like the coyote responds like Roadrunner or something like that.
Yeah.
No, it feels very laughable. But we'll talk about why this is. Like, I think that this kind of ties into Nebuchadnezzar's dream from last week.
Yeah.
I think that the reason he responds this way is because he can tell this is a bad omen, right? I mean, think about how terrified we would be. I mean, like, it's easy for us, like, you know, we're just reading this story from a distance. Imagine right now, as we were talking, a hand appeared and started carving words into my wall. I think that we'd probably have the same reaction, because we'd be like, this does not seem like a good sign. Like, this isn't like, you know, this isn't like an angel showing up and saying, "Greetings, highly favored one." It's like, this is not good. And so let's break it down and talk about why. Keep in mind, the last chapter ended with Nebuchadnezzar praising, exalting, and honoring the King of Heaven. And then next verse, it just says, Belshazzar the king held a great feast. But keep in mind, the book did not originally have chapter divisions, right, or verse numbers. Originally, it went straight from Nebuchadnezzar the king, praising, exalting the King of Heaven. King Belshazzar had a great feast. What's the first thing you noticed? Like, notice just reading that.
That's a different guy.
Yeah, that's a totally different guy. And again, that's shocking if you know Babylonian history, right? We just jump forward decades. Like, this isn't like the next day. This is like throughout this, Belshazzar is going to call Nebuchadnezzar his father, but we know for a fact that like Nebuchadnezzar was not his literal father. Yeah. We actually don't even know if they were related at all, because Belshazzar is not the guy who followed Nebuchadnezzar, and he's not the guy who followed the guy who followed Nebuchadnezzar, and he's not the guy who followed the guy who followed the guy who followed Nebuchadnezzar. Like, I think he's like 4 kings removed, and technically, as we will see at the end of the day, he's not even officially the king. And so him calling Nebuchadnezzar father or something like that.
Why, part of the reason why it struck him that he was like, oh, whoever can interpret this will become the third ruler.
That will tie into
Babylon.
That's another thing that's really cool, because Daniel never explains why third. But keep that in mind, because that will be relevant later. Daniel never explains why specifically third and not second in command. But that will be relevant later. But yeah, so we're like, wait, this is a different person. Belshazzar is not Nebuchadnezzar. But also, whenever you hear the name Belshazzar, what do you kind of think of? Daniel's other name, right? Because what is his other name?
It's like Belshazzar.
Belshazzar. So very similar, right? And so for a second, you're like, wait a second, is Daniel king? No, this is not Daniel. This is another guy. And he is decades later. So Daniel's no longer a young man. He's an old man. But he's not going to show up in the story right away.
When he calls Nebuchadnezzar his father, he's more likely calling him like his ancestor or predecessor.
Yeah, ancestor, or just like a term of endearment.
Yeah.
You know, like it's kind of like whenever we say like Father Abraham, like
Yeah.
like I'm not directly descended from Abraham, but like he's somebody who's like we owe our legacy to. Yeah. So Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. I'm just gonna spoil the end of this story for you real quick.
Oh, no spoiler.
I know. I'm sorry. I
I
was really debating on whether or not like there is, I think, a benefit to reading this chapter without knowing the end of the story, but there's also another benefit in reading it with knowing it. I think Daniel intentionally saves this information for the end, but like I said, the end of this chapter, Babylon will fall, and while Babylon does kind of fall in a day, there had been a siege going on for a long time, and so this feast is going on while Babylon is under siege.
Oh, and does that play into why this guy is king?
It's kind of like
It does a little bit, yeah.
It's kind of like the French nobles throwing a bunch of parties while the peasants are starving.
Yeah. And it also ties in, this will tie into the archaeological stuff we talk about in the end, because the archaeology actually explains that the feast was actually a part of the reason why they fell. To where it's actually cool where the archaeology is like, oh yeah, by the way, they were feasting. You're like, that's exactly what Daniel says. But it was because it just caught them off guard. But also it's because they were cocky. Like they thought Babylon could never fall. And so here you've got this guy, he's throwing a feast, even though there's enemies all around them, but they're like, we got this, we're fine. And so he holds a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles. So keep in mind, if there is an enemy around, the nobles should probably be the ones doing something about it.
Yeah.
But instead, they're all just having a party, and he's drinking wine in the presence of them. Let me just say this also. Is it generally a good look for a king to be getting plastered in front of, like in general, that's not a good look for any politician, to be getting plastered in front of also fellow politicians? Like, that's just not a good sign in general, right? I mean, like, imagine that, like, Trump got together, like, all, like, the leading dignitaries in America, and they just had this, like, throwdown where everybody got, like, plastered drunk, making totally stupid decisions. That would just not be a great look, right? But that's kind of what's going on here. So right off the bat, you get the idea. This Belshazzar guy seems a bit cocky and a bit hedonistic, right? You don't, right off the bat, you get the impression he's not maybe the best leader, right? Yes.
Also, one kind of random war strategy thing to point out is that if you have the king and his nobles all in one place, that becomes a
ideal place to attack.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good target. I mean, that's what Israel did to Iran. But
Yeah. No, I remember there's this TV show called Homeland. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Great show. But like the season finale of like the first season is literally like a terrorist. He intentionally like fakes an attack so that all the politicians have to like flee together to a panic room, and the real attack is going to be in the panic room because like he was like, I just want to get all the politicians together because then I can take them all at one time. So it's like he found like some like low quality like some low stakes politician and just like shot him out in the street so everybody would panic and go to the panic room, and he's like, that's where I really want to get people. But yeah, so in general, a lot of politicians in the same place, really cool things can happen, or kingdoms can fall. So, previous chapter ends, Nebuchadnezzar praising the God of heaven. Next chapter begins, Belshazzar is throwing he's just getting debauched, getting plastered drunk, and then notice what he does while he's getting drunk. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, right, so he's getting drunk, he all of a sudden has a good idea. Let me also just say this. Usually you do not make good ideas when you're drunk. But he's tasting this wine, he's like, I know what we should do. He said to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So what's his great idea in his drunken reverie?
Flash the gold, silver.
Not just any gold and silver, though.
Let's mock Yahweh.
Yes. Yeah. So, last chapter ends, Nebuchadnezzar praised the God of creation, the Most High God, like he can do no wrong. He is amazing. 2 verses later, Belshazzar's like, yo, let's go take the stuff from his temple and get drunk on it. Like, so you're like, you couldn't have a more stark contrast, right? For us, we've had like a week between studying this. If you're just reading through the book of Daniel, this is back to back, right? Nebuchadnezzar, praise God. Belshazzar's like, yeah, I'm going to go take his crap and get drunk with it. This is not a good sign, right? Especially whenever you consider the fact that like these were like holy vessels. Have there been any other stories where we have had pagan people try to take vessels from, like holy vessels from God, and use it for themselves?
Wasn't the Ark?
The Ark of the Covenant, yeah. You were there for that, right? That was years ago when we were studying that. That was in 1 Samuel. What happened? Do you remember what people group was it?
It was the
Philistines.
The Philistines. And what did they do?
They put it on a horse and
They put it next to their Dagon, right? And then Dagon's head fell off. They put it back up, and they started getting cancer.
Yes, yeah. So basically, the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant in battle because the Israelites were being stupid. So very similar situation, right? The reason why all these things are in Babylon is because the Jewish people were being stupid, right? So that's a common thing. But the Philistines, they captured the Ark of the Covenant, and they said, we're going to put the Ark of the Covenant in our temple, and it was going to be like a spoil from war. They come in the next day, and their God has fallen before it, and they're like, oh, crud. And so they put the statue back up. The next day they come in, and it's just shattered. It's like, oh, crud. So they're like, we're going to get rid of this. And then all of a sudden, like, boils and stuff start breaking out on them, to where eventually they just throw that thing onto a cart, slap the cow's butt, and say, go back home. And then there's literally just some farmers who are like chilling out in the field one day. They're like, is that the Ark of the Covenant? Whoa, that's crazy. So, long story short, last time some pagan leaders decided to disrespect holy vessels from the temple, or I guess at the time the tabernacle, didn't go so well for them, right? How do you think this is going to go for Belshazzar?
Not well.
Not well at all, right? He's taking these holy vessels, which represent like the last remnants, because keep in mind, Jerusalem has fallen at this point, right? Where we were at in the last chapter, we don't know where that was at exactly, but at this point, Jerusalem has definitely fallen. And so, Belshazzar decides to do this so that all of his kings and nobles, his wives and concubines might drink from the vessels. So this is a way of spitting in the face of their God, right? These things are supposed to be for you, but we're using them not even for them in like a dignified state. They're using it to get drunk off of it, right? It's just for a party. So they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem. Do you see how the author's like emphasizing these details, like so you realize how insulting this is?
Yeah.
And the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. There's really no new information there. It could just say, and they did so. But the author goes out of his way to repeat it so you realize what a great affront this is.
Like the depth of the situation.
Yes.
Right?
He's like, hey, let's go take those articles and let's get plastered off of them. And then he says, so they took the articles that were from the temple in Jerusalem, from the house of God. They took them. And him and his wives and his concubines and the nobles and their wives and their concubines, they did that.
And then they drank the wine and praised their idols.
Yes, they drank the wine and they praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. All right. So last chapter ends, Nebuchadnezzar. There's one God. He is worthy of all praise. He can do no wrong. A few verses later, Belshazzar, yeah, we're going to take that God's stuff and we're going to party with it and get drunk. And while we do so, we're going to praise gods who are made out of the same stuff that we're using to party with. And if you're reading the book of Daniel all the way through, whenever you hear of gold and silver and bronze and iron, what do you immediately think of? From earlier in the book.
The big statue.
The big statue, right? Obviously, stone and wood don't show up in that statue, but the first four do, right? Gold, silver, bronze, iron. Tell me, what happened to that statue by the end of the dream?
His head was cut off.
No, it was shattered.
It was shattered, right? It was demolished, right? A stone came out and just demolished the whole thing, ground it to dust. So there's like this deep irony here, to where they are literally praising. Yeah, they are praising these. Are you saying the pun because of irony? That's funny. That was unintentional. I like that. But I didn't even catch that. I was like, what did I do? I must have done something clever. No, there is this irony here where he is defying the God who made all things while praising the gods who are made of the same stuff that they're using to drink out of. Right? So it just like shows how confused they are. Which, keep in mind, that whenever you hear of Babylon, that's what you're supposed to think. Right? You shouldn't be surprised when this is the third story that we've encountered so far in 5 chapters where a Babylonian king has a dream or vision or miraculous experience and he can't explain it and his magicians can't explain it. Because if you go back to Genesis chapter 11, why is it that Babylon got its name in the Tower of Babel story? Like, what does the word Babel mean?
Doesn't mean just like nonsense.
It means confusion. Right? Because God confused their languages. And so we shouldn't be surprised that whenever you get to the book of Daniel, 3 out of the first 5 chapters deal with Babylonians being absolutely confused. And every single time, you've got to have a Jewish person who enters into the scene to explain things. Mm-hmm. Right? That's what it is. Because it's like that was the whole goal of, Tower of Babel. God splits everybody up, and he says, all right, now I'm going to pick Abraham, and I'm going to produce something through him. Right? And so Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they kind of are the legacy of Abraham. Right? They are providing insight into the confusion. And so these things right here just show how confused the Babylonians are. They're praising the gods whose statues are made of the very thing that they are getting drunk off of, while also insulting the God who created them and everything else. And so in the midst of all this, a God who is not made out of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone decides to communicate to them. And in order to make it clear that he is not made out of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone, he decides to communicate in a way that is absolutely, undeniably supernatural in nature. Right? He does not simply send Daniel in with a message. He does not simply communicate through a dream or a vision. Instead, in the presence of everybody, he has a hand appear and inscribe something on the wall. Long story short, this is communicating, I am more powerful than your gods. Right? And so, I think Belshazzar, even in his drunken state, he's like, oh crap. Him being drunk could also explain why he's reacting so cartoonishly as well. Right? Suddenly the fingers of a man's hand came out and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. In my head, I always picture this as like a giant hand, but it just says a man's hand, so it could just be like a regular sized hand. I don't know. But yeah, so what happens here?
A disembodied hand essentially just starts writing on the wall.
Yeah.
And the king freaks out.
Yeah. That kind of reminds me of the hand from the Addams Family.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just shows up and it starts writing on the lampstand on the plaster of the wall. Just the detail of the plaster of the wall, in my head, just the imagery, it almost scares you, because if it just said started writing on the wall, it almost would feel fake. But it's no, it was writing on the plaster of the wall. It's almost like the person describing it, Daniel, he physically saw it, right? Like he physically saw the remnants of this, where it's the letters were etched into the plaster. And keep in mind, this is something that you would be able to notice, right? I mean, people would chisel stuff into walls back. I mean, you have Egyptians who are chiseling stuff, but the idea of somebody just it would look very noticeably different, right? It wouldn't look like the work of a chisel. It would look distinct to where it's almost, it is very haunting, just the whole image of this. And so they're sitting there, and the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing, right? He's just sitting there and probably thinks that he's tripping on some sort of drugs or something. Yeah. Just a hand just drawing letters. And they're watching this. Then the splendor of the king's face changed, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack. I put the literal translation here because I thought it was funnier. The literal translation is that the knots of his loins were loosened. What does that sound like? What are your loins?
Okay. Maybe he was having an erection and...
No, okay. That's not where we're heading. So, not that. Your loins are just your general lower area, right? So, if the knots of your loins are loosened, what does that seem to suggest occurred? It sounds like the imagery is supposed to be like peeing or pooping yourself, right? I'm not saying that literally happened, but it seems like that is the portrait that the author's trying to convey, right? Because it's like, the idea is like your loins are here, and the knots are the things holding it all together. If those knots are loosened, everything's coming out. You know what I mean? So that's why like his hip joints being slack is just like, huh? Like, that's weird. But the literal translation is like, oh, that's that's kind of funny. Like, it's literally, I think the author is going out of the way to portray him in a cartoonish light. Here's this guy who is the king. He is so proud and bold as to take in the vessels from God's holy temple and use them to party. And then all of a sudden, like, all it takes to humble him is a hand showing up out of nowhere and carving words that he can't even read onto a wall. And all of a sudden, he's like, oh crap, literally. He's like, oh no, like this is not good. To where all the party's just instantly over. This guy, like, he doesn't even know what it says yet, but he's instantly put in his place. So it says the splendor of the king's face changed. What does that imply?
Like his face just fell.
Yeah, well, the idea is like the blood drains from his face, right? Very similar to like with Cain and Abel, where it's like, why is your face downcast? Except this is more like just the blood draining from his face. His thoughts alarmed him. What's going on there?
He's puzzled.
Yeah, he's trying to figure out what the heck's going on. Which, again, we would be responding the same way. Like, even with this story existing, if a hand... Well, actually, since this story exists, I'd probably be even more terrified if the hand showed up here, because I know what the story means. But even knowing the story exists, if a hand showed up and did this, we'd be in the same place. Our thoughts would puzzle us. We're like, whoa, like, this can't be good news, right? This is not stuff that regularly happens. Even if it was just a bad trip on, like, LSD or something like that, still not good news, right? Something wrong is happening here. And then the knots of his loins were loosened. It could be the idea that, like, I guess you could suggest it's just, like, his muscles are, like, just, like, going weak. But the next part says that his knees were knocking against each other. It's like it's like the idea is he's shaking. Like, he's like, this ain't like Elvis when he's like, my legs are shaky and my knees are weak. In Elvis's case, he's in love. That is not what's happening here with Belshezzar. He is absolutely terrified, and it seems like the author is suggesting that he like peed or pooped himself. I just find that funny.
Quick note here in the NIV, I think it translates it a bit better than his hip joints went slack. It says his face turned pale. And he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking.
Oh yeah, that works.
Yeah.
Like he essentially just falls back on the ground.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Like it's almost like a horror story, like a horror movie, right? Like you just see this, and like you can imagine the camera like just like panning over to him, and he's just like shrinking back, and like the camera's like shaking, and like horror music is playing. I do want to highlight a verse that we've actually covered in this Bible study before, but it was months ago. Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1. Keep in mind that Isaiah is writing centuries earlier, but he says, "Thus says Yahweh to Cyrus his anointed." This is interesting because keep in mind Cyrus is going to be the Persian king who overthrows Babylon, yet God calls him Mashiach, right? To Cyrus his Messiah. So he's an anointed one, akin to Saul and David and Solomon and Jesus. So thus says Yahweh to Cyrus his Messiah, whom I have taken hold of by his right hand. Notice what he says about Cyrus. He is going to be sent to subdue nations before him and to loose the loins of kings, to open doors before him so that the gates will not be shut. So, hundreds of years earlier, God promises through Isaiah, hey, I'm going to appoint this guy named Cyrus, and he's going to loosen the loins of kings. Fast forward to Belshazzar, and Daniel says, his loins were loosened. So, even though we don't know the end of the story yet, Isaiah kind of lets us know where the story's heading. Who do you think's about to knock at at Belshazzar's door? Cyrus, right? The Persians are coming. That's where the story's heading, right? This is where it's one of those places where if you pay close attention to the language of scripture, you already know where the story's heading, right? You're like, oh wait, okay. We have a king whose loins are loosened. Cyrus must be here. Yeah. So, verse 7. The king called out loudly to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. Like this just, I can picture it clearly in my head, right? Like he's freaking out, he's drunk. Get everybody in here! Like he's absolutely going bonkers. Does not know what the heck's going on. He wants everybody in here to explain this right away, and he's probably being very irrational about it too. He's like, y'all are gonna figure this out for me. I need an answer now. He knows this is not a good omen. The king answered and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this writing and declare its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and rule with power as third ruler in the kingdom. All right. So, what does he say?
Figure this out, you're third in line.
Yeah. Figure this out and you are third in line. Contrast this with how Nebuchadnezzar's done this, right? Because again, this is our third instance where a Babylonian king found himself confuddled by something and he needed help.
Well,
how did Nebuchadnezzar respond?
Nebuchadnezzar, granted he had a dream, he was alarmed, but he called it, the first time he called everybody in and said, tell me my dream, tell me what it means, and if you get my dream wrong, I'm killing you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Nebuchadnezzar is threatening them, and Belshazzar is just promising them,
I like Nebuchadnezzar's better because it seems like there's no incentive to lie. Here, you could lie, maybe get away with it, and get rewards. Whereas if you're dealing with Nebuchadnezzar, you're dead.
Yeah, that's what. So we talked about with Nebuchadnezzar that he consistently is portrayed as a wise king. Even though he's a bad guy, he's still portrayed as like, there's a reason why he's called Nebuchadnezzar the Great, right? I mean, he was a good king. And so whenever he has a dream that terrifies him, he says, I want y'all to not only interpret the dream for me, I want you to tell me the dream. And if you get it wrong, you die. And that's because he knows that if he tells them the dream, well, then they might just make up an interpretation that sounds good to him. He does not want that. He wants the actual interpretation, and therefore he says, I want you to tell me the dream itself so that I know that the gods are communicating to you. And if you can do that, then I have reason to trust what you're saying afterwards. And if you fail to do that, then I know you've lied to me and you're going to die. So Nebuchadnezzar, he sets it up perfectly where nobody can lie to him. This guy is like, whoever can tell me what this means, you get to be third in charge. Well, everybody's going to want to do that, right? Everyone's like, well, yeah, me. But what we're going to see is that nobody's going to be able to do it anyways. And that's because I think this actually ties in more to last week's dream. Why was it that none of the people could interpret it last time?
They didn't know it, and they knew if they went to the king and lied to his face, there was a good chance he was going to kill him.
Yeah. So, well, I guess last week's chapter, it was more along the lines of, the dream was not that hard to interpret, but they knew it was bad news. And therefore, they're like, we don't want to be the one to tell the king. Because if we're the ones to tell the king bad news, we could die. And that's whenever Daniel shows up, and Nebuchadnezzar says, you're going to be safe. Just tell me what it means. This seems to be a kind of similar situation to where everybody can tell that it's bad. But then it gets a little bit more complicated by the fact that it is clearly written on the wall, right? So you could argue that some of them would just want to lie and make up something in order to attain that power, but the issue is they can all see the letters. And so they now have to come up with something that explains the letters. To be fair, there was a lot of illiterate people back then, but the feast is filled with nobles who most likely could read.
It's not even just the nobles now. Like he probably threw all the noble people out when he called like the wise people in.
Well, they're going to
these
show
are
up again
like-
a little bit, but yeah.
Well, yeah, but these are like the most scholarly people
Yeah.
in the whole kingdom.
Yeah, so that's the one thing that makes it harder for them to lie here. But the reason they're not responding to him is not because he was as smart as Nebuchadnezzar. It's simply because this is a harder thing to lie about, because there is literally writing on a wall, and whatever lie they come up with has to somehow make sense of the writing, right? Like, they can't just pull something out of their butt. And that's going to be what's so interesting whenever Daniel shows up, because
Do
whenever...
you think the writing was in Aramaic?
I would assume so, because whenever Daniel reads it, it seems like the puns that he makes hinges on it almost being like the Aramaic alphabet. But it is possible it could have been like, I don't know, cuneiform or something like that. But I'm assuming that it's written in Aramaic.
Well, if it's in Aramaic, then why can't the Babylonians?
We'll talk about that, because whenever Daniel actually reads it, it does not make sense at first. Like, it's like, we'll talk about it. The words that are on the wall are literally just like, they're just like terms for like currency. Mm-hmm. It's like it's as if it said like penny, nickel, dime.
Wow.
So it's like even if they can read the words, they have to figure out why the heck a hand would show up and write those words. And so that's why it's difficult for them, right? So Belshazzar is not setting this up, like, he's setting it up for a lie.
Okay, this goes back to, like, kind of reminds me of a story in 2 Kings where you had a king who was unfaithful, and I can't remember, I think it was Elijah, right? He said, go, point the bow out, shoot the arrow not so many times, you will shoot the arrow towards the Philistines, right? And then he said, take an arrow or a spear and stab it into the ground. And then he gave him a riddle prior, and he stabs it. The king stabs it in the ground 3 times. He's like, you foolish, should have grabbed it 5 or 6, stabbed 5 or 6. Otherwise, he would have completely destroyed the Philistines. But you will diminish them 3 times, they'll come back.
Yeah.
So he gave him a hard riddle because he was an unfaithful king. I feel like it's the same thing here. We have a king who's obviously blatantly going against Yahweh. Therefore, God gives him something very difficult to interpret and understand.
Well, and it's going to be something that paves the way for whenever Daniel actually does offer an explanation, you know it's the correct one, because everything lines up perfectly. Like, it's almost like he doesn't even just give one explanation. It's like it's a multi-layered explanation, which is going to be really cool. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so the reason why these people are not lying to him is not because Belshazzar was as smart as Nebuchadnezzar, right? It's actually just because the riddle is too difficult, to where God actually prevented them from lying, because they would have every motive to do it, right? If they lie and come up with a good lie, they could be third in charge. But unfortunately, the riddle is too difficult, and they can all tell that it's bad news, but they have to find a way to come up with an explanation that makes sense of it while also hopefully lessening the blow so that it isn't as bad of news. Does that make sense? And so all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and the splendor of his face changed further, and his nobles were perplexed. So this is even worse news, because all the best of the land cannot explain this to him. And so we move on to the next part of the story. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. The queen answered and said, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or the splendor of your face be changed. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, set him as chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me, that they might read this writing and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now if you are able to read the writing and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple, and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will rule with power as the third ruler in this kingdom. Alright, so, what goes down here?
So the queen, right? Okay, so do we know, and maybe you can jump forward a little bit, maybe there's some archaeological stuff that explains, but do we know who this queen is? Because we've seen he has wives, concubines, etc. But I notice the scripture goes out of the way to mention it's the queen.
Yeah, so people debate about this. Some have suggested that maybe this is like the queen, like mother, like in the sense of like maybe it's his father's wife. Mainly because since it already said that like the wives and concubines were in the room, and spoiler alert for the archaeology stuff, we have reason to believe that it was Belshazzar's father who was the actual king at this time.
Yeah.
And so whenever it says the queen, it could be referring to his mom coming in, right? So maybe she was
Which
not
is
at the
why
party.
he could only promise them to be third in line.
Yes.
Because he was second.
Yeah. And that's what's weird about it, because for the longest time, again, I'm spoiling the archaeology stuff, but for the longest time, people thought that Daniel was just like making this stuff up. But then we discovered evidence for Belshazzar outside of the Bible, and then we discovered evidence that he was kind of king, but kind of not king for a long time, which would make sense of this whole interaction, right? So we have reason to think that maybe this is like the mother, or
It's kind of like how he's like a crown prince, but he
Yeah.
almost has as much power as the king himself.
yeah. And so it might be the mom. But what happens here? The queen comes in, and what does she provides a solution.
You ever heard of Daniel?
Yeah. You ever heard of Daniel? Is there a story in the Bible that this makes you think of? We've brought it up almost every week in the book of Daniel. But is there a story where there is a king who is troubled by something, and then somebody says, "Hey, have you thought about this person?" Joseph. Yeah. What were you thinking of?
Saul and
Samuel?
Right?
I'm not sure. Maybe. I mean, I guess you could have whenever Saul's going crazy and they're like, "Hey, we got this guy named David to play music for you," but I'm not sure. What I'm thinking of is the story of Joseph with remember Joseph is in prison and he interprets these dreams for like the cupbearer and the baker.
Yeah.
The baker ends up getting killed. The cupbearer gets spared. Joseph says, "Remember me whenever you go before Pharaoh," but then the cupbearer forgets him for a while. And then, whenever Pharaoh has a dream and he's troubled by it, the cupbearer's like, "Hey, you remember Joseph? Like, let's bring him out of here." And so Joseph comes out. But then this also reminds me of Joseph in another way. Because, do you remember how the book of Exodus starts off? Like, what was it that is like almost the inciting thing that causes Pharaoh, or this particular Pharaoh, to be okay with enslaving the Israelite people? Like, what is one of the few things we know about this Pharaoh right off the bat?
It's been a while since I've been through Exodus.
It should be in like the opening verses of Exodus chapter 1.
We get some
well, no, it's,
genealogy, birth of Moses.
Is it like at the end of Genesis?
No, Exodus 1:8.
The new king to whom Joseph meant nothing.
Yeah. And a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And it was that king who was totally fine with enslaving the Israelite people, because he's like, "I don't know who Joseph is. Like, I don't owe Joseph nothing," right? Because centuries passed, right? Belshazzar is kind of in that place, right? It seems like Daniel, he was in a place of prominence under Nebuchadnezzar, but Belshazzar is not Nebuchadnezzar's son or his grandson or anything like that. He's not the direct successor or the successor to the successor. Now, it's been a little bit, right? It's only been a few decades, but it seems like Daniel maybe was not in such a prominent place with those other kings. And so time has passed to where the queen mother, or whoever the queen is, she knows of Daniel and she knows his reputation, but Belshazzar does not know anything of Daniel, right? Which might also explain why he was so quick to just like play around with the vessels of the temple and stuff like that. Like, it seems like he just did not regard those things highly, right? Maybe he just did not, I don't know, he was maybe so busy partying that he'd never received an omen from the god where he had to consult his diviners or something like that.
To be fair, it only took Manasseh a decade or so to completely undo everything Hezekiah had done.
Well, Manasseh's name also
like,
means to forget, so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's just like, oh, my dad tore down all the idols and the altars and stuff. I'm going to rebuild literally all of it because I think they're good.
Yeah. So we can go through this slide probably a bit quicker just because it's all just set up. So the queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king. So he's freaking out. She comes in. She's probably not drunk. She's like, okay, tell me what the problem is. I'll come up with a solution. The queen answered, said, King, live forever. Sucking up to him. That's how you're supposed to talk to a king. Don't let your thoughts alarm you or the splendor of your face be changed. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him. So Daniel has a reputation that precedes him, right? She's like, hey, Nebuchadnezzar had stuff like this happening every other week, and Daniel was consistently able to help out. This is your first time communicating with the gods. Daniel's got this, right? Let me go get Daniel. He will solve everything. Don't you want to be like that? A person with that type of reputation? It's like, hey, if we can just get Nick in the room, all our problems will be solved.
Wait, no. This kind of reminds me of stuff that happened in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, where the kings would distance themselves from the prophets, and they get their seers and everything. They'd be like, we don't know what this dream means. We don't know what this writing means. And then one of their, and then there'd be a guy who comes in and says, hey, there's this guy named Elijah who is a man of God. Maybe we should bring him in to get insight.
Yeah.
And kind of reminds me of that pattern in 1 and 2 Kings.
Yeah. It's a consistent thing through Scripture.
Yeah.
So he says, there's this man. He's got wisdom of the holy gods. In the days of Nebuchadnezzar, he was able to help things out. Maybe he'll be able to help you out too. This was because of an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel. So basically Daniel was just like the ancient Sherlock Holmes of Babylon. Like, he has a reputation of just solving these impossible problems. Or Benoit Blanc. Yes, that's basically what he has a reputation of. And I think that's so cool. Actually, fun fact, in the Catholic Apocrypha, right, which includes like extra books, there is an addition to the Book of Daniel which has him solving a mystery. It's actually a really fun story. Hello, Brienne. Yeah. But basically, the queen acknowledges that there's something about this guy. He has a special spirit inside of him that helps him do this. We'd probably say that's the spirit of God at work, right? And then I love that, like, it's almost like Daniel has become like a legend in Babylon, to where like the name is reserved for like later on, right? There's this man. He can work all these things. And it was because of all this that these things were found in Daniel, whom the king named Belshezzar. Like, it's like she saves the name for like later on, where it's like it almost feels like there's like this epicness behind him. Let Daniel now be summoned.
It seems like, given the time that has passed between Nebuchadnezzar and like Belshazzar, that Daniel's probably like 80 or 90. So he was doing everything in the beginning of the book when he was like a teenager or 20.
Yeah. And now decades have happened. Like, all these adventures have probably taken place that we just haven't heard of.
Yeah.
Like, Daniel's just, solving like Hound of the Baskervilles and like any like a new Knives Out entry every single week. So he's got this like reputation, right? So Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah?"
Oh, I'm a different Daniel.
Now, imagine how terrifying this might be for Belshazzar. Moments ago, he was insulting the God of Judah by drinking from the vessels. Nobody can answer this. The queen enters and says, there's one guy who might be able to do it. Oh, where's he from? Judah. Oh, crap. It's like,
I imagine Daniel just walks into the banquet hall, looks over at the vessels, and he's like, are those from the temple?
Yeah. Oh, also, I forgot to highlight this. We didn't even talk about this in the last part. But notice it said, suddenly the fingers of a man's hand came out and began writing opposite the lampstand. Right? So, like, the lampstand is like the menorah from the temple. Right?
Yeah.
Like, the light from the temple is being cast onto the wall.
Mm-hmm.
and that's where it's writing. Like that's got to be intentional, right? It's specifically the light from the lampstand right there. Like it's like a book light. It's just like
so like instead of that light like being down, it'd be straight.
yes, it'd be straight on the wall, and it's the light from the temple right there, and that's where it writes like. And then now all of a sudden, yeah, and like also, I forgot to mention this as well. Have there been any other places in Scripture where we have seen people writing with a finger? I can think of 2 instances. It actually does not show up that often. One is before this, and one is after this.
10 Commandments?
10 Commandments, yes. Remember it says that, at least the first set of commandments, before Moses broke them, it says that they were inscribed by the very finger of God, right? The only other story actually comes from the Gospels, in a debated passage from the Gospel of John, the story of the adulterous woman whenever Jesus gets down and he starts writing in the sand, right? But there are not that many stories of people writing things with their fingers, and usually it is God himself doing it, right? I just want to highlight that. I forgot to mention that earlier.
Maybe his handwriting's just really good.
It may be. So Belshazzar's like, are you the Daniel that's from Judah? And he's probably like, even in his drunken state, he's probably like, the odds of this are too, like, he's probably starting to put stuff together. He's like, I think that the God of Israel might not be happy with me. So he's like, I've heard about you, that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found to you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me, that they might read this writing and make its interpretation known to me. But they could not declare the interpretation of the message. You notice how he doesn't mention how the writing got on the wall? He's like, hey, he's like, Daniel, I was wondering, could you explain this writing to me? He doesn't say, we were partying with the vessels from your God's temple, and all of a sudden a hand showed up and carved this on the wall. Could you explain that? Instead he's like, hey, don't look at that menorah over there. No. Oh, crazy. Looks like the one in your temple? That's wild. Crazy odds. But no, he's just like, there's this writing on the wall here. I need you to explain it. He's almost just presenting it as if it's like just a riddle. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the writing and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple, wear a necklace of gold around your neck, you will rule with power as the third ruler in the kingdom. He says, Daniel, you have everything to gain by this. Just
what an enticing offer for a 90-year-old man.
Right?
Just like...
Yeah. Well, notice Daniel's
give
response
you all
here.
These gifts.
Like, it's going to be kind of funny because the power dynamics have totally shifted, right? Like, whenever Daniel goes before Nebuchadnezzar, he's being very respectful and kind, and you can tell that, like, Daniel's like a young guy talking to a powerful king. Whereas, just wait for Daniel's response here. Like, Belshazzar has no power. Like, he wishes he could be Nebuchadnezzar. And spoiler alert, that's going to be part of the message. It's like God's like, you ain't no Nebuchadnezzar, my dude. Like, you ain't him. And Daniel at this point, he's just like a 9-year-old guy, and he's like, what do I care about power? Oh, sweet, 9-year-old guy, third in power. Like, okay, sweet. But you can tell those are the things that Belshazzar values, right? Whereas Nebuchadnezzar valued truth, and he wanted to get down to like the heart of it. Belshazzar is like, I value power, and so if giving you power is what'll give you, like, get me an answer, cool. Whereas in reality, the magician should just give them an answer regardless of what the reward is, right? If you have to motivate people with money to give you an answer, you got to realize that that's like not, like, I don't know, like
they're supposed to be your servants. You don't.
Yes.
You shouldn't have to offer money or a reward to.
Yeah. Well, it shows how fickle his power is. Mm-hmm. Where he's like, he feels like he has to offer out extreme amounts of power just to get people to do what he wants. Nebuchadnezzar's like, I don't need to offer you power. I will kill you. It's like that's a guy who knows he's in charge. Belshazzar's, he's like he wants to be in charge, right? He's living like a kind of like a spoiled prince in a way. All right, verse 17 through 24. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts remain with you, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the writing to the king and make the interpretation known to him. Daniel's like, bro, like, just keep that stuff.
Your stupid gifts.
O king, the Most High God granted the kingdom, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. And because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every tongue feared and were in dread before him. Whoever he wished, he killed, and whoever he wished, he kept alive. and whoever he wished he raised up, and whoever he wished he made low. But when his heart was raised up, and his spirit became so strong that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from the sons of men, and his heart was made like that of the beasts, and his place of habitation was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of the sky, until he knew that the Most High God is the powerful ruler over the kingdom of mankind, and that he sets up over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not made your heart lowly, even though you knew all this. But you have raised up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you. And you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and of gold and of bronze and of iron and of wood and of stone, which do not see, hear, or know, but the God in whose hand are your life breath and all your ways you have not honored. Then the hand was sent from him, and this writing was inscribed.
So he basically gives him a recap and says, "You're no Nebuchadnezzar."
Yeah. He's like, Nebuchadnezzar was way more powerful than you, and God had a way of humbling him. You've been arrogant this whole time, despite the fact that you knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, and that's why God sent this writing on the wall. But yeah, I can interpret it for you. So what do y'all think about Daniel's response here?
Very cool. He's just basically starts off being like, I don't care. Keep your stupid gifts.
Daniel's like, Sonny, I don't got time for this crap. I'm getting too old for this. Yeah, let's walk through it. So Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts remain with you, or give your rewards to someone else." There's so much snark behind that. So what does he communicate? He gives, like, first off, he doesn't say, "May the king live forever" or anything. He just responds like a guy who's like, I've seen guys like you rise and fall a million times. He gives the king two options, right? Rather than the king bestowing things on him, he's like, I'll give you two options. What are the two options?
Keep your gifts or give them to someone else.
Yeah. Yeah, he's like, just keep your power, keep all that stuff. Or if you're so desperate to give power away because it seems like you think that matters, I don't know, just give it to, I don't know, maybe Fred wants it. Like, just, like, you can tell that he just does not care about this. However, I will read the writing to the king and make the interpretation known to him. What do you notice about the response there? Contrast this with how everybody else responded. How did Belshazzar respond when he saw the writing?
He freaked out.
Freaked out like a cartoon character, right? Peeing and pooping his pants. How did the magicians respond?
Total confusion.
Total confusion. They have no idea. They're like, we're stumped, honestly. Even like, despite the fact that they have everything to gain, right? If they could just come up with something, that'd be good. But they can't come up with anything.
No, he's just like, you can keep your stuff. I got this. I'll do it.
Yeah. Daniel walks in and he's like, "Oh, elementary, dear Watson." Like, he's like, this is fine. He's like, he's like, I solved a Sudoku puzzle harder than this last week. He's like, sure, yeah, I can read the writing for you and I'll give you the interpretation. This is actually very simple compared to stuff I've had to do in the past. Back in Nebuchadnezzar's day, I literally had to guess his dream from nothing. This is literally written in stone. Come on, like, yeah, I got you. So Daniel does not find this hard at all, which I just find funny. And he says, "But before I tell you the interpretation, let me give you a history lesson, because apparently you forgot." Which, again, it just feels so condescending. Like, Daniel seems like the one in charge here. Like, he's just like he does not seem like he's in a rush to get to the message. He's just like, let me learn you something new, King, because you need to understand, like, more important than the message itself is why the message was sent.
Yeah.
So let me tell you why. O King, the Most High God granted the kingdom, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. So according to Daniel, why is it that Nebuchadnezzar was powerful?
Because God made him so.
God made him so, right? And so there's really two things being communicated here. On one hand, Nebuchadnezzar was powerful because God gave him that power. And secondly, you aren't Nebuchadnezzar, right? That did not say God granted the kingdom, grandeur, glory, and majesty to you. No, he gave it to Nebuchadnezzar, right? Nebuchadnezzar was way better than you are. And I think Belshazzar would even know that, right? He knows that he's not stupid. Like, he knows he ain't no Nebuchadnezzar, right? He just wants to be a Nebuchadnezzar. And because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every tongue feared and were in dread before him. That's true, right? Nebuchadnezzar was known as like a warmonger, and like he destroyed peoples before him, right? People bowed down, right? There's a reason why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the only ones who did not bow down before the statue, right? Nebuchadnezzar is terrifying, but he's going to say that that's not the case with you. For Nebuchadnezzar, whoever he wished, he killed. Whoever he wished, he kept alive. Whoever he wished, he raised up. Whoever he wished, he made low. Right? Nebuchadnezzar did not have to make these grandiose promises to try to get people to do his will. Right? He didn't have to say, hey, I'll make you third in the kingdom if you can do this for me. He just said, do it or I'll kill you. If I want to elevate you, I will. Right? Because Daniel was elevated by Nebuchadnezzar. But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't having to make this like these grandiose promises out of like a desperate attempt to gain people's obedience. So he could kill people, he could keep them alive, he could raise them up, he could make them low. But even with Nebuchadnezzar, right? Nebuchadnezzar, like the way Daniel's talking about him is that Nebuchadnezzar is like the best of the best, most powerful man ever. But even when his heart was raised up and his spirit became so strong that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne and his glory was taken away from him. So who's the one who gave Nebuchadnezzar the glory? God. And so by implication, who's the one who took it away? God. Yeah. So Nebuchadnezzar, most powerful man in the world, yet he's not as powerful as the God of Israel, right? And keep in mind, Daniel's leading this to the fact that that's the God you mocked. So it's like, you ain't no Nebuchadnezzar, and you have the audacity to mock the person who put Nebuchadnezzar in power. That's why the handwriting's on the wall. So God deposed him. He was also driven away from the sons of men, and his heart was made like that of the beasts, and his place of habitation was that of the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of the sky until he knew that the Most High God is the powerful ruler of the kingdom and the mankind, and that he sets it over whomever he wishes. This is all stuff that we read last week, right? And if this sounds like recap, that's because it is. And it's not only recap for us, it's recap for Belshazzar. Apparently this was a story that the Babylonian nobles were aware of, because while the Babylonians probably are not going to record this in their annals,
they're like, hey, remember that time the king disappeared for 7 years?
Yeah.
Was eating out in the field?
Yeah, if a person like Nebuchadnezzar goes absolutely nuts for 7 years, people are going to remember that, especially when he comes back out being like, the God of the people of Judah did that to me, and I want to praise him now. Like, they're going to remember that, right? They're not going to record it in the history books, because that'd be embarrassing. But they're going to keep that in mind, and that's going to be like a rumor that continues circulating amongst the king's courts, especially, keep in mind, this is a few decades later, right? Nebuchadnezzar, best king. Hey, what happened in those 7 years where he wasn't doing much?
I forget about it.
Yeah, let's not talk about that, right? But so he says that Nebuchadnezzar did all this stuff. Verse 22, yet you, his son Belshazzar, right? So we know that he's not Nebuchadnezzar's literal son, but he is the heir of Belshazzar's kingdom, right? I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, yeah. He is not Nebuchadnezzar's literal son, but he is the heir of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, to where, in a way, Nebuchadnezzar is his father. Yet you, his son, the heir of his things, have not made your heart lowly, even though you knew all of this. Some have suggested that maybe Belshazzar was like one of his sons-in-laws, but we don't know for sure. We don't know enough about Belshazzar outside of this to know what the relationship was. But he says, you did not humble yourself, but you knew this story. So apparently the Babylonians knew this in addition to it just being recorded in the Bible. But instead, you have raised yourself up against the Lord of heaven. And then this is where Daniel's like, I'm noticing that the stuff around here in this room comes from our temple. And they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. Keep in mind that Daniel, he ain't stupid, right? mean, I guess maybe he did tell him that like what they were doing ahead of time, and it just isn't recorded in the text. I'm assuming that Belshazzar did kind of try to conceal that information, but Daniel, like, he came from Jerusalem, and if you remember, Daniel was a noble in Jerusalem, so he knew what the vessels in the temple looked like, right? Whenever they got carried away, it was a big deal, and so he's in here and he's like, yeah, that's the menorah from our temple. These are the vessels from our temple. And so he says, let me get this straight, Belshazzar. Nebuchadnezzar is way more powerful than you are. God put him in power. You knew that God put him in power. You knew that God took him off the throne. You knew that God humbled him and that he was a wild beast until he called on the name of God. And now you have the audacity to mock that same God by bringing the vessels of his temple in here for a party, and you're not even close to being what Nebuchadnezzar is. And like it's almost like Daniel's like, you should have been shocked if a hand didn't show up and write something on the wall, because you're just being stupid. And it didn't stop there. You have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which do not see, hear, or know. He says you added insult to injury. You insulted the living God while drinking from objects made of the very gods that you worship. And you were worshiping them at the same time. He says this is just stupid. But the God in whose hand are your life, breath, and all your ways, you have not honored. Why do you think the word hand shows up there? Well, let me say this first. What is he communicating by that phrase? The God in whose hand are your life breath.
He's trying to communicate that your life is essentially in God's hands. He goes, if God wanted you to strike you dead now, he could absolutely do that.
Yeah. If God can give and take away Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, he can give and take away your life. Right? Your life is in his hands. But why do you think he specifically brings up the hand right now?
Because it's the same hand that wrote on the wall, but this comes full circle because Belshazzar does not know that Daniel knows that there was a handwriting on the wall.
Yes.
So it's always like, oh, bleep.
Yeah. So Belshazzar has not told him a hand showed up and wrote on the wall, as far as we know. He just said, interpret the message. Daniel says, these are the articles from the temple, and your life is in the hand of the Most High God. So even before he's got into the actual interpretation of the message, Daniel's made it pretty clear that he is very aware of what's going on here. If anything, this whole speech has proven to Belshazzar that he should probably listen to Daniel, because Daniel is aware of stuff that Belshazzar has not even told him. But it gets even worse than that, because him saying, the God in whose hand are your life breath and all your ways, he is the God who wrote on the wall. And spoiler alert for what the message says, it basically says that Belshazzar's life is going to be taken away. And so, literally, Belshazzar's life is in God's hands. Because the hand showed up and said, your life is over. So that's kind of, that's why there's a bit of a pun there. But the God in whose hand are your life, breath, and all your ways, you have not honored. So that's a problem. And the irony of that, like if you put like the contrast, what is in Belshazzar's hand right now?
The vessels.
The vessels of silver and gold, right? Which are ironically the same things that the gods are made of, right? So Belshazzar has gods in his hand, but then there's this other god who has Belshazzar in his hand. And Daniel's like, I am so perplexed. You are defying the God who has your life in his hand, but you're honoring the God who is so small that you can hold it in your hand. He says, make that make sense for me, right? One God has the whole world in his hands, and he has control over you. You insult him, and you got these tiny little gods that you can fit in your own hand, and you worship them. Like that does not make sense. The only reason that makes sense is if you just think this whole religion thing is stupid and you view yourself as your own God. Verse 24. Then the hand was sent from him, and this writing was inscribed. Right? So your life is in God's hand, and because your life is in God's hand, he sent his hand forward to write a message on your wall. It's like, oh So we finally, at last, arrive at the message. As you can see, I've inscribed the message up there on plaster. Let's read through it. Daniel says this. Fun fact, this is the end of the chapter, right? He's going to interpret it, and then Babylon will fall in a verse. This is what it says. Now this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene. God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel. You have been weighed on the scales and found lacking. Peres. Your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar said the word, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him, that he now would be the third powerful ruler in the kingdom. That same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62.
Darius? Interesting.
Darius the Great, by the way.
What?
So that's Darius the Great. Is it not?
It might be. I think people debate about who exactly this Darius is.
Well, it's either Darius the father of Cyrus or Darius the son of Cyrus.
Yeah, but
I think it would make more sense to be the father. But
yeah, people debate about it though, because I think some people debate that it's an entirely different person altogether.
But yeah, no, there is a Darius the Great mentioned in like the line of Persian kings, though. I do know.
No, there is. So Darius is a Persian name, but people debate about who exactly Darius the Mede is. But that's a whole other side point. So what happens here?
I notice how he says mene twice. He's saying your kingdom will be put to an end twice, essentially. And then you have been weighed, meaning you have been judged, essentially, and you have found lacking. You are not to God's standard. And then the last word kind of parson. Why is it a parson versus Paris?
Paris. Yeah.
Paris.
So Upharsin is the plural of Paris.
Okay.
So yeah, we'll talk about that as well.
So your kingdom has fallen, you have been judged, and your kingdom will be given over.
Yeah. So there are multiple layers of meaning to this, and this is the passage where I was saying this is like the punniest passage in the Bible, because it really does demonstrate how wise Daniel is. Because on one hand, he just walks up to it, looks at it, he's like, "Oh yeah, I got that. I'll explain that to you in a second. But first, let me preach to you." Daniel's like when it comes down to actually explaining it, it's very short. The previous verses, Daniel goes on this long rant about history. He's like, "Let me tell," he preaches a sermon, and then he's like, "Oh yeah, by the way, here's what the text says. Here's what it means," and then he just stops talking, and it's like, "Oh yeah, Belshazzar clothed him and stuff. Then Belshazzar died, and then it happened."
So when are you thinking that? What time is this? After?
This is 539. 539 BC.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. If you look it up, people debate about who Darius the Mede is. We probably don't need to spend too much time on it. Darius the Mede is one of the people that people debate, did he actually exist, right? Like I said, people challenge the authenticity of this chapter. We'll talk about that at the end. But for now, Daniel says, now this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene tekel upharsin. It's possible that the people were able to read this. They just couldn't interpret it. But one thing I'll highlight is that Aramaic, if you look at it, up there, it does not have spaces between the words, and it does not have vowels. And that does complicate things a little bit because usually it is context which helps you interpret what the message says. This is true with Hebrew as well, right? Nowadays, if you read a Hebrew Bible, they will put vowels and spaces and stuff, but that's usually to help people who are not natural Hebrew readers. And you can see this in English, right? if I were to text Joseph and I would say, like, I don't know, like, if I were to send a message like WHTSGNGN, you might be able to interpret this like, oh, what's going on? I mean, nowadays we do stuff where it's literally just acronyms, like LOL, like WID, what you doing? Like we do stuff like that, and there is a general understanding amongst us what that means. If you got a person who spoke Hebrew coming over here, and you sent them like LOL, they'd be like, what is LOL? Like they wouldn't get it. Or if I were to write out my name as just DVD, and I were to text you, hey, this is DVD, you'd be like, oh, that's David, right? Like, you'd be able to figure that out. It's a little bit harder, though, if there was no context behind it, right? Imagine that somebody totally random just texted you, and they took all the vowels and all the spaces out of their message. You'd be like, I have no idea what this is saying. So context largely changes how you interpret something. And so it's possible that they were able to read this. They're just like, I don't know how to, like, where does one word end, where does one word begin? And they might even have been able to arrive at mene, tekel, upharsin. But the issue with that is that those are simply currencies, right? Mene, it just sounds like a mina, which is a currency which is about 50 or 60 shekels, right? A shekel is like a day's wage, right? And so 50 or 60 shekels is like 2 months' wages, right? And so there's a mina, okay? Mina. And then tekel sounds like shekel, so that's also that's a currency, it's a day's wage. And then you have upharsin. The u is just that's like the and, right? So it's mene, tekel, and pharsin. And pharsin is the plural for a word which is paris, and that's half of a mina. So those are all currencies. And so even if they were able to read that, they have to figure out what the heck is going on here, right? It's as if it said, what do you think? It's like, I guess you could say $1, a penny, and half a dollar. Or no, it's like $2, a penny, and $half. You'd be like, what does this mean? But first off, let's just ask this. What does that sound like? Like in the ancient world, you're listing out a bunch of currencies. What are you immediately thinking of?
The business transaction.
There's a business transaction, and how do business transactions, how would they go down in the ancient world?
They're supposed to be equal.
They're supposed to be equal, but how do they judge if something's equal?
Oh, with a scale.
They bring out a scale, right? They bring out a scale, they put some money over here, and you weigh it out, right? And that is a judgment process, right? You are making sure that they are equal, right? If you want 5 apples, well, I'm going to put 5 apples over here, and we're going to weigh out money like that, does that. Or, whatever the exchange rate, it's to make the scales equal. That's why whenever you go through the prophets, a lot of times they're getting onto people for unjust scales, right? They would weigh them differently so that they could cheat people. And so the whole thing is, no, you have to have just scales. So this sounds like a business transaction of some sort. And business transactions require evaluation and judgment. And Daniel says that's exactly what's happening right here. There is an act of judgment, and you're the one being measured. And so Daniel begins to explain what this means. So that's why I said, right here, there are literally 4 levels of interpretation here. The first one is the straightforward one. They're just currencies, right? Mina, shekel, pharsin, right? It's just 4 currencies, right? $2, a penny, and $half. But then Daniel interprets it. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found lacking. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. And so what Daniel does here is he basically just uses, there's a pun going on, right? The currencies happen to sound like other words, right? So the currencies are all nouns. But if you turn those currencies into verbs, they sound like verbs that would be used in evaluation or judgment processes, right? The word mene sounds like the verb mena, and the word mena means to number. So Daniel says, God has numbered your kingdom and put it into it. Right? Mene, God has mena, your kingdom, and put it into it. Why is it repeated twice though? I don't think that it's that the kingdom's going to be ended twice. What does it mean? Like, why is it mene mene?
Maybe he's saying that
It's important.
it's important, and maybe another interpretation is that maybe we could weigh him twice and it still wouldn't be enough.
I think he's more so pointing out that like your life is, your life has been numbered and God's going to put an end to it.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's emphasizing the quickness of it.
Yeah.
Right? It's like it is putting it into it. It's like your days are numbered. Your days are numbered. Right? It's like there's the emphasis.
Your days
Numbered.
are numbered.
Numbered.
Your day is numbered.
Yeah, it's like, well, exactly, right? It's like the repetition conveys the severity and the what was the word I'm looking for? I'm losing the word, but it communicates how strong what's going on here is. It's like your days are numbered. No, in case I stuttered, your days are numbered. God's about to put an end to your kingdom. As we're going to see, verse 30, that same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed. So it's like, yeah, your days are like, this is the final day. Tekel, you have been tekal. You have been weighed on the scales and found lacking. You see how it's an evaluation process?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you have like this business transaction going on, and it sounds like currency, and he says, but it's not simply the money that's being weighed. He says, you, Belshazzar, are being weighed. And you're being, who's he being compared to? I'd say there's two people he's being compared to. Who was he being compared to in the previous verses whenever Daniel was preaching out? Nebuchadnezzar, and who's even bigger than Nebuchadnezzar? God. Belshazzar over here, he's acting like he's better than Nebuchadnezzar, and he has the audacity to like spit in the face of God. And Daniel says, you've been weighed, God's over here, you're over here, and I hate to break to you, you're found lacking, right? Nebuchadnezzar's over here and you're over here. You're found lacking. And that's why it's also funny, because if you look at what the currencies are, the mina is 50 or 60 shekels, right? And if you go back to Daniel chapter 2, whenever Nebuchadnezzar had the dream of the statue, what did the gold represent? It represented two things.
Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon.
Yeah, so the gold represented both Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar, in a way, represents the entire kingdom. So when you go to the first line, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Well, that represents Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. So Nebuchadnezzar is represented by the mina, 50 or 60 shekels. But now Nebuchadnezzar is being weighed next to Belshazzar over here, and Belshazzar ain't no mina. He's a shekel. Right? So it's like you're being weighed, and Nebuchadnezzar is like 50 or 60 times heavier than you are. And so like you see like there's like these levels of like he's just outright insulting Belshazzar here, but it's also funny because like the currency actually carries a message, right? You have been weighed on the scales, found lacking. You do not compare to Nebuchadnezzar. You definitely don't compare to God. They're both weightier than you are. If Nebuchadnezzar is a mina, you are a shekel. You're a day's wage. You're nothing. Who are you to be giving away like a third most powerful in the kingdom? Then you get to the last part. Uparshin, right? So that's the plural of peras, and peras means to divide. Your kingdom has been peras, and given over to the Medes and the Paras, the Persians. There's literally a double pun in this one, right here. I just love it. It's so fun. So your kingdom is divided. And how has it been divided?
Between the Persians and the Medes.
Yeah, it's being given to two people. Sure enough, the Babylonian Empire, so Babylon replaced Assyria, and the people who replaced Babylon are going to be known as the Medo-Persian Empire, right?
Or
It's,
the Ark and
what's that?
There's like two different names for it.
Yeah, but it's often called the Medo-Persian because it's the Medes and the Persians side by side. And so he says your kingdom has been divided and given over, right? And the word divided is peros. It sounds like the singular of Upharsin. But then it gets even crazier because the people who it's going to be given over to is the Medes and the Paras. So who it's being given over to also sounds like the word that is written on the wall. And then it goes even deeper than that, because the word Medes literally just means middle land. So it's being divided in the middle and given over to the Medes and the Paras. It's just there's so many layers of puns going on here. And then, so if the mina represents Nebuchadnezzar and the shekel represents Belshazzar, then what does the Paris represent?
Persians.
The Persians. Well, not just the Persians.
And the Medes.
The Medes and the Persians. But if you go back to the message, Upharsin, what did I say Upharsin is?
And
It's the plural, right? Upharsin is the plural of Paris. So you don't have just one Paris, you have two of them, right? And I pointed out that a Paris is half of a mina. And if you add two Parises together, what do you get? A mina. So Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom is being split in two. And you've got two Parises, which add up to a mina. The amount of puns going on here, amazing. To where if you just look at the currency, it literally works. It's like, hey, Belshazzar, by the way, you ain't no Nebuchadnezzar. You're a shekel compared to him. However, I am going to send people in here who are going to destroy you, and they're not going to amount to Nebuchadnezzar level, but they're going to take Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom and split it in two, and each of them will be about half a Nebuchadnezzar. Right? There's going to be the Medes and the Persians. This is where, I just imagine all the other magicians being over here being, so jealous. They're like, dang, this Daniel dude's this is literally Sherlock Holmes level stuff. Where he's just putting this stuff together and they're like, let him cook. This is crazy. This is genuinely mind-blowing stuff. And what I love about all that is that he doesn't go out of his way to explain the nuances of it. We're having to go, I literally have to do little things on the side here to break it all down. Daniel is just super straight, he's straight to the point. He spends a longer time preaching at Belshazzar, and then he's like, oh yeah, by the way, here's what it says, here's what it means. And then he just stops. He just stops talking, and it doesn't say that Daniel left or anything. It just says, then Belshazzar said the word, and they clothed Daniel with purple, and they put a necklace of gold around his neck. They issued a proclamation concerning him that he would now be the third most powerful ruler in the kingdom. So, to Belshazzar's credit, he does what he promised. But what's the irony there?
he doesn't become king.
Yeah, so first off, the kingdom's about to fall, but also Daniel didn't even want this.
Yeah.
Right? Daniel literally said, give it to somebody else. He didn't want it. But Belshazzar's like, hey, a promise is a promise, man. And it seems also that Belshazzar isn't taking Daniel's word seriously, right? It seems keep in mind, the feast is already at nighttime, right? It is nighttime when this is going down, right? They had candles shining, which means that it wasn't daylight outside when this went down. And it says that night Belshazzar is killed. So this is all within a few hours of him dying. You would think that if God said, your days are numbered, you've been found lacking, your kingdom's going to be divided, he would have more important things to get to than hey, you know what? Hey everybody, we're going to issue a proclamation. This guy's third in charge now. You think that he'd be assemble the troops, we need to save ourselves. But instead, he just doesn't seem to take it seriously. And so, verse 30, that same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed. You also notice that God didn't give him a chance to be saved. Right? Whenever Daniel talked to Nebuchadnezzar in the last chapter, he said, if you humble yourself, you might be able to put this off a little while. That was not an option here. He just says, this is what is going to happen. Numbered, weighed, and divided.
You're cooked.
Yeah, you're cooked. And so that same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62.
Oddly enough, I've just been looking through Wikipedia. I know, not exactly the greatest source, but it does provide a lot of information that we don't necessarily get from the Bible, and of course those sources can all be tainted or taken out of context or what have you, but it seems like in most interpretations Darius the Mede is either one of two people.
Mm-hmm.
Neither of which really makes that much sense, considering neither of them is a Mede. But it could be Cyrus, and it could also be the general who entered Babylon during its fall, because Cyrus didn't actually enter the city upon its fall.
The general is the more common interpretation. Yeah. But he's not usually known as Darius, right?
I know.
Yeah.
He was like godiness or something.
Yeah, the main thing that's beneficial to that whole thing is that a lot of people were known by different names, and we know that Darius was a name that like Medes used, and so
it could also just have been like the governor that Cyrus put over the medieval kingdom at the time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the thing. It just says that he received the kingdom at the age of 62, but it doesn't specify.
Oddly enough, though, Cyrus was around the age of 62.
Yeah.
Like when he conquered everything. So.
Yeah, but
it's weird why they call Cyrus Darius.
It makes no sense because his son was also. Like, one of his sons was named Darius as well.
Yeah.
But,
okay. We are getting way too sidetracked by this. I like how I told Nick we don't need to focus on it. He continued to focus on it. We're still focusing on it. But, all of it, there is ultimately explanations that we just might not know. Because one thing we have to remember is that the ancient world is just like, we're going off just like a few sources that tell us everything we know about the ancient world, and a lot of them don't have the full picture because a lot of them are written like hundreds of years later and stuff.
Yeah.
But long story short, there have been people with this chapter in particular, like this chapter is the one that comes under the most fire by like critical scholars claiming that Daniel's just making this stuff up and he don't know what he's talking about. And that's why now that we finished the chapter itself, I guess I should just point out. Babylon's gone, Medo-Persians are here, exactly what God said would happen came to pass that very night. And this is what leads people to say, oh, well, isn't that convenient, right? Like they're saying, they would suggest that this is just a story that's made up to make the God of Israel look really good, but really there is no place for this in the actual history of Babylon. But, like I pointed out, in the last several centuries, archaeology's become like a really big thing. Keep in mind that, like nowadays we take archaeology for granted. It is like a very recent science. It only became like a big thing in like the 1800s. To where really, actually Napoleon was the one who really like kind of kicked off this whole archaeological like craze. But it wasn't until like the 1800s that people started like taking it more seriously and developing like different ways to like actually go about it in like a methodical manner. So a lot of archaeological things that we've discovered have been in the last like 2 centuries. And as a result of those archaeological discoveries, we have very good reason to believe that Daniel actually knew, like the things found in Daniel actually provide a more accurate description of what was going on in Babylon than many of the other sources that we had prior. Because a lot of the sources that we had were just like Greeks reporting about what happened in Babylon. But the cool thing is that we actually have found some Babylonian sources as well, archaeologically. Right? Because like the Greeks were good, like they wrote like books and stuff that we have, like centuries later. Whereas because of archaeology, we excavate Babylon and stuff, and we've actually found some stuff. And so, here's one thing we have here. This is known as the verse account of Nabonidus. If you remember on that timeline that I showed you at the beginning, Nabonidus is credited as being the final king of Babylon. Right? I think he was like the 4th or 5th king after Nebuchadnezzar. Those kings in between, they only reigned for like 5 years maximum. One of them literally reigned for a month. So it's kind of like during like the 1st and 2nd king's time period.
And Nabonidus overthrew the former king.
Yes.
So he wasn't actually part of like Nebuchadnezzar's line.
Yeah. Well, he might have also been like a son-in-law or something like that. But I forget the exact details. Yeah, so Nabonidus was not a direct son of Nebuchadnezzar or anything. And he is, like, in the Greek histories, he is the one who is credited for being the final king of Babylon. And that is why, for the longest time, people were always like, oh, Belshezzar, like, whenever Daniel calls Belshezzar the king, people have always said, Daniel's making this up. We know who the final king of Babylon was, and it was Nabonidus. But then, we discovered this thing called the verse account of Nabonidus. And so one thing I will say, we do know from other accounts that Belshazzar was Nabonidus' son. So people did not say that Belshazzar didn't exist. They simply said that Daniel got his details wrong, right? They're like, oh, well, Daniel obviously, maybe he knew about a Belshazzar and he just thought he was the king, and so he made this story up. Because the Greeks never mentioned it. Whereas when you look at this story, like this is from the verse count thing, it's written in cuneiform, that's what those little scratches are. It mentions this about Nabonidus. So after Nabonidus had obtained what he desired, a work of utter deceit, had built this abomination, a work of unholiness, when the 3rd year was about to begin. So what it's describing there is that Nabonidus was known for worshipping gods that the Babylonians didn't exactly approve of, right? Like their chief god is like Marduk, and he decided to worship other gods as his chief god. And so they're kind of just like talking bad about Nabonidus here, being like, yeah, like you almost kind of get the impression that they think that the fall of Babylon was because of him just being like a heretic. And so after he had obtained what he desired, this work of utter deceit, this like idol, and he built this abomination, a work of unholiness, so this idolatrous temple. After he did this, in the 3rd year of his reign, which was around 553 BC, 14 years before Babylon fell, when the 3rd year of his reign was about to begin, he entrusted the army to his oldest son, his firstborn, right? And that would be Belshazzar, right? So the Babylonian Chronicle is telling us that Nabonidus entrusted his army to Belshazzar. The troops in the country he ordered under his command. He let everything go and entrusted the kingship to him, to Belshazzar. And himself, he started out for a long journey. And if you keep reading the rest of this, it tells us that Nabonidus actually went away from Babylon, primarily because of his religious desires. And he ended up dwelling abroad, and he dwelled specifically in a city called Tama over in like Saudi Arabia. And for a solid decade, he actually ruled Babylon, not from Babylon itself, but from Arabia. And during that decade, Belshazzar was ruling in his place from the city. And so whenever you actually read the Babylonian account, it never directly calls Belshazzar king, but it does tell us that Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to Belshazzar.
Yeah.
Right? So technically during this time, it's not a direct co-regency, but it basically is. To where technically Nabonidus is still the king, but Nabonidus is literally, like, for literally the majority of his reign, Nabonidus is just over in Arabia doing his own thing. So the people in Babylon are not actually seeing Nabonidus. He is the one who's reigning, but Belshazzar is the king that they see. He is the son of the king to whom the kingship had been entrusted, right? And so this was basically what went on for the majority of the reign. From 553 to 542 BC, this is the situation that they're in, and Babylon falls 3 years later. And so Nabonidus returns, but only for 3 years. But then it gets even better than that, right? When you read that, and you compare it to the histories that we already had, all of a sudden things begin to fall into place, right? Both of these accounts are detailing the fall of Babylon itself, right? This is what Xenophon says in what he calls the Cyropedia, which is funny. It's like the history of Cyrus, right? And Xenophon says this: "Thus then, his men were employed." So this is Cyrus's men. "Thus then, Cyrus's men were employed, while the enemy upon the walls laughed at his siege works to scorn, in the belief that they had provisions enough for more than 20 years. So the idea is that Cyrus is laying siege to the city of Babylon, and the Babylonians from within the city are laughing at him from the walls. And that's because they think that they have enough provision to last themselves 20 years. The idea is like that they think they're going to last forever, right? They don't have anything to worry about. Upon hearing of this, Cyrus divided his army into 12 parts, as if intending each part to be responsible for sentry duty during 1 month of each year. Then, when he heard that a certain festival had come around in Babylon, during which all Babylon was accustomed to drink and revel all night long, Cyrus took a large number of men, just as soon as it was dark, and opened up the heads of the trenches at the river. And then he storms in and he takes the city." And so basically, it seems like Cyrus was laying siege, and all the Babylonians are laughing at him and being like, "Oh, you're never going to get in here. We can hunker down here for 20 years if you just lay siege to us." They think we can't fall. But then Cyrus learns that they're throwing a party in the city, and they're just not even taking the siege seriously. And so he takes advantage of that, and while none of them are looking, he breaks into the city. and that's how he conquers it. And so this is what the histories are telling us, which that lines up directly with Daniel, right? Daniel says, yeah, they're throwing a party in the city, and then they break in. Herodotus, in his book, The Histories, says something very similar. Now, if the Babylonians had knowledge of it beforehand, or had perceived that which was being done by Cyrus, they would have allowed the Persians to enter the city and then destroyed them miserably. So Herodotus says, if the Babylonians knew that the Persians were attacking, the Babylonians would have actually just let them come in and they would have wiped them out easily. The whole reason why the Persians won is because they caught the Babylonians by surprise. But as it were, the Persians came upon them unexpectedly. And owing to the size of the city, so it is said by those who dwell there, after those about the extremities of the city had suffered capture, those Babylonians who dwelt in the middle did not know that they had been captured. But as they chanced to be holding a festival, they went on dancing and rejoicing during this time until they learnt the truth only too well. Babylon then had thus been taken for the first time. So he says that the people in the center of the city didn't even realize that the city had been captured until it was too late. Like the city was captured and the people in the center of the city are still partying, which lines up directly with what Daniel says, right? The idea is that the idea is that as the writing is on the wall and Belshazzar is wrestling through all of this, the city is literally being captured by the Persians. Daniel comes in, he interprets it. He says, "You're going to die." And then they get there to the center of the city, right? Which is pretty crazy. And what goes beyond all this is that there are other sources detailing the fall of Babylon as well, and none of the sources position Nabonidus as being in the city on that night. Not by name, at least, right? Every single source agrees, like every source that names Nabonidus by name agrees that he was outside the city whenever it fell, right? All the sources that mention him by name say that he actually went and fought Cyrus elsewhere, and that Cyrus actually showed him mercy and spared his life. But this is where there's a conflicting account, because the ones that mention Nabonidus by name say that he fought Cyrus elsewhere and Cyrus showed him mercy. But there is one account which says that when Cyrus stormed the city, he killed the king. And that is from Xenophon. But as a noise and tumult ensued, those within heard the uproar, and at the king's command to see what the matter was, some of them opened up the gates and ran out. And when Gadatas and his men saw that the gates had opened, they dashed in pursuit of the others as they fled back into the palace. In dealing blows right and left, they came into the presence of the king. And they found him already risen with his dagger in his hand. And Gadatas and Gabrius and their followers overpowered him. And those about the king perished also. One where he had sought some shelter, another while running away, another while actually trying to defend himself with whatever he could. So this is interesting. All the other accounts we have that mention Nabonidus by name say that he was not in the city when it fell. Instead, he went and fought Cyrus elsewhere. Cyrus showed him mercy and let him go into exile, right? And then he died later on. This is the one account that says that the king was in the city and that he did die when Cyrus stormed it, but it never says the king's name.
Doesn't even say that Cyrus was the one who stormed it.
Well, what I'm saying, Cyrus's command,
yeah.
Right? But this is interesting, because if you read this alongside with Daniel, it all slides into place. Because now you have somebody who is being called the king, but he's never explicitly called Nabonidus. And all other reports tell us Nabonidus wasn't there. Which means you have to ask, who is the king who was killed? And Daniel gives us that answer. Whereas prior to the discovery of that tablet where it says that Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to his son, everybody just thought these were conflicting accounts. Some say that that Nabonidus was out of the city. Some say that he got killed in the city. They just thought it was conflicting. Whereas that one account that tells us, actually, Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to his son, all of a sudden it all shifts into place, and it actually argues in favor of Daniel accurately reporting the story. And that's why this is like one of the coolest things to me. I'm like whenever people look at this, like, so it turns out that we spent all this time criticizing Daniel and saying he didn't know anything, when in reality, the stuff that is found in Daniel actually sounds like it was written by somebody who was in the city when it fell. Because he actually names names that no other author names. Right? Like he says, by the way, that king who died, that was Belshazzar. Right? And it actually provides details that it literally is written like an eyewitness account of somebody who was in the city when it fell. which is way more personal and knowledgeable than any of the other accounts we have. It's kind of cool. And so I wanted to highlight that because as I was looking into this chapter, I was like, I knew I'd heard about this stuff before, but I hadn't like looked deeply into it. And I was like, why aren't more people talking about this? Because this is like really cool to where it's like a puzzle piece to where people were, I don't know, they were like fitting the wrong pieces together all this time. And then all of a sudden, they like got a picture of what the puzzle was supposed to look like, and they're like, "Oh, we've been building it wrong." And then all of a sudden, it just like slides into place. That's kind of what this is like. It was literally that like this one discovery right here. It just like it explains everything. It's like, oh yeah, well Belshazzar was not the king, but to the people in the city of Babylon, he was the king. Yeah, like he was a co-ruler. But if you're living in Babylon, and the guy who is your actual king is like living in Saudi Arabia for the last 10 years, you're not calling him king, right? His son, who is actually ruling over you and interacting with the people on a day-to-day basis, that is the king, right? And whenever that guy falls, that's when you know that crap has hit the fan. And so, like, this discovery right here is just like, it changes everything to where it's like, it perfectly harmonizes with the Bible, and it actually makes it to where you look, you're like, oh, so the Bible is actually like,
There
telling a
is
legit story.
a situation that this reminds me of, which I will talk with you about later.
ha ha ha, those of y'all watching online, you don't get to hear it. But yeah, so, and what's cool about this is that there's a lot of stuff like this that happens with the Bible. It seems like every time like the Bible comes under like heavy scrutiny, God just like allows like some archaeological discovery to like come out and like prove it. Like for a long time, people were like claiming that like David was like a made up figure in the Bible, and then all of a sudden, archaeologists discover like this. It's called a stela. Like basically, it's like a really big stone that has like basically stuff written like this. I think it's the Tel Dan stela, which has this, and it just says like, we killed this person of the house of David, and it's like, oh, okay, and it's like written like from around the time period that David lived. So it's like, well, yep. So David lived. He had a house. It was notable. But stuff like that constantly shows up. And for a long time, I think it was the Hittites that people thought that was just like a made up people group. They're like, yeah, the Bible makes this big deal of like the Hittites, and like they just did not exist. And then all of a sudden they discover stuff. They're like, oh, turns out the Hittites did exist, and they were like a huge people group that we just did not know about. And stuff like this happens like all the time. Very encouraging. I think it's cool. So figured I'd share that with y'all. Every now and then I like to do stuff like that. Anyways, do y'all have anything y'all want to add about Daniel chapter 5? We didn't really talk any application or anything, but anything y'all want to highlight? I guess you could, if writing ever shows up on the wall, it's okay to poop yourself. I think that's understandable.
Yeah.
I can't think of it.
Not right now.
So, well, let me ask you this. What is the big takeaway here? Like, why was the story even written?
Don't mock God.
Okay. Well, like, let's even contrast it with the last chapter. What was the message of the last chapter?
That
Like, humble yourself before God.
Okay.
More along the lines to me of like, even the most, even the greatest kings of like all time can be humbled before God, can be made low to even like beasts of the field.
Yeah.
And in this one, it's essentially the case again of like, you're really none of us are anything to God. Like he holds our lives in his hands.
Yeah.
Quite literally. So, just remember that.
Yeah. So when I look at like chapter 4, I think of Nebuchadnezzar, and he represents like to the people who the book is written. Nebuchadnezzar represents like Thanos. Like he is like the big bad guy that you absolutely hate. And he's arrogant, he's proud, he's as powerful as you can possibly be, yet by the end of the story he's falling on his knees and praising the God of Israel. Which tells you that God can humble whoever he wants. And that there is hope for anybody. Right? I mean, here you've got the Gentile king who literally destroyed Jerusalem, and he was sent by God to judge the Jewish people. Yet now he is praising the God of Israel. And like it shows like, again, how God can take what the enemy meant for evil and work for good. Like he can use Jewish hard-heartedness to bring about Gentile salvation. That's really cool. But this chapter almost like reels you in and make sure you don't go to the opposite extreme and say that doesn't mean that like every single Gentile king is just going to be like perfectly good now. It's like no. Like arrogance is the problem, right? It's like
Pride's the problem.
like one issue that you see in the New Testament, right? Paul gets onto Jesus gets onto the Jewish people first for being arrogant, right? And thinking, oh, you think you're a son of Abraham? God can make sons of Abraham from these stones. And Paul writes later on in his letters, and he writes to Christians, and he says, hey, be careful. The Jewish people swelled in pride because they thought that they were something big. And now God's judging them. And he says, be careful lest you do the same thing. And he says, don't boast over your Jewish brethren, right? Because guess what? If God was willing to judge the Jewish people, how much more is he willing to judge you? And so I feel like Daniel chapter 5 is kind of communicating that same message. It's like, if God judged the Jewish people for being, for being proud, how much more is he going to judge Babylon? Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, the Jewish people were given like a lot of warning ahead of time. Hey, God's going to judge you in the distant future. Hey, Assyria's coming. Hey, Babylon's coming. Eventually, whereas when you get to Belshezzar, Daniel's like, you got 15 minutes. If God is willing to do that to the Jewish people, how much more to the Gentiles? And like, as Christians, we should take that to heart. Because guess what? We're Gentiles. Right? And if God was willing to, if he's willing to judge them, like how much more, like, we need to realize that we can't boast over our Jewish brethren and be like, ha ha ha. I think I look at like Christians who are like, man, those stupid Jews, why do they not understand that like Jesus is the Messiah? And like, they almost like take a position of like arrogance because of how spiritually enlightened they are. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, be careful there. Like, that's the grace of God working in you. Like, do not think that you are better than somebody simply because you are maybe more spiritually mature or maybe you're further along. And that even actually works amongst fellow Christians, right? Whenever you start getting cocky and thinking, yeah, look at me, I'm like a super Christian over here. Like, I have books of the Bible memorized. Like, the moment you start getting into stuff like that, be careful, right? Because you are doing the exact same thing as Belshazzar, and all it takes is like, a person like Daniel showing up and saying, yeah, you think you're Nebuchadnezzar. You ain't no Nebuchadnezzar, right? We were talking about earlier with in the book of Ezekiel, how Ezekiel says, like, he compares Daniel to Job and Noah. And he's like, yeah, these people are on par. Well, this is like Ezekiel coming to us and being like, hey, Rocky, you ain't no Simon Peter, right? It's like, you think you're a big deal, but you ain't him, It's like, hey, Nick, you ain't no King David. Joseph, you ain't no Moses. But there's this temptation within us, once we're faithfully reading our Bible, we're going to church, we're beginning to see the fruits of the Spirit show up in our lives, we're like, all right, I think I'm getting this Christian thing down. And it's like, well, be careful. Let anybody who is swelling in pride, like, take heed lest you fall. Don't be like Belshazzar, because you don't want to have your days numbered or be weighed and found lacking or have your metaphorical kingdom divided. But God can't do it. So I think that would be like the application we could take from that.